I'm Marla, and I'm so happy to be serving as the president of the chapter. Thanks to everybody again for joining us here in person and on Zoom. We always like to start our meetings by welcoming any new members. Do we have any new members in person here tonight? Oh, we do. Thank you so much. And if you're a new member joining us on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand or give us a note in the chat. We're so happy that you're here. And also for any returning members, thank you so much. We're so happy that you're part of our chapter. And I'm showing these are all a variety of plants that were blooming in my garden on the same day earlier this month. We've had a wide variety of blooms this year because of all of the rain that we've gotten. And so I'm just hoping that everybody was able to get out and see the beautiful diversity that's out there and appreciate the benefits of all of these native plants. So we had a great fourth Saturday walk this past Saturday here at the park. The focus was on native landscaping, and the walk was led by Joan Miller and Drake White. Thank you, Joan and Drake. We had at least 30 people that joined this walk, and we were able to look at some of the plants that are around the Urban Ecology Center here, as well as the demonstration garden, and focused on those plants that are really good in a garden setting and readily available in our local nursery. So that was a great time. We've got another event coming up for the fourth Saturday Nature Walk next month on July 22nd that our chapter is a co-sponsor for. And this one is focusing on ethnobotany, and it's being led by Josie Gonzalez. So that should be a really good one. If you're interested in attending, you need to be here by 8 a.m. That's when it starts, and it should run to no later than 10. Meet here at the Urban Ecology Center, July 22nd. We want to thank all of the volunteers that helped out to be at an education and outreach event here at the Festival of Flowers earlier this month. We want to recognize Haley for setting up the booth, and then any of the volunteers that helped to spread the education about the benefits and beauty of our native plants at the booth. Thank you so much. And then we have a call for volunteers for an upcoming event. It's the All Aboard Expo 2023. It's the Nursery and Landscape Expo. This is a huge expo. They expect over 5,000 people to visit this over the course of the days that it's held. What we're looking for is for volunteers to represent our chapter, and actually there will be other chapters represented and talking about the benefits of native plants, but also our programs and our state organization. And so this is going to be August 10th and 11th. It's going to be in downtown San Antonio at the Henry B. Gonzalez Convention Center. And we're gonna have multiple shifts over both days between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. And Pam is here. There she is right there. If you're in the room and you're interested, please talk with Pam. She's got a sign-up sheet. If you're joining us on Zoom and you're interested, please reach out to npsotsavolunteers@gmail.com. And we're looking at possibly having 2 shifts, 9 to 12:30 and 12:30 to 4. But Pam says, if you want to come do it, you can make your own shift. We're looking for anybody that's interested in representing our chapter and our organization. And this is a great opportunity to do a little bit of volunteer work, but then also explore the expo. So please reach out if you're interested. We also have a new article in our monthly newsletter where we're asking people to share their gardening tips, hints, and hacks. And thanks to Pam for writing our first article. If you saw our last newsletter, she gave some helpful information on how you can create some temporary shade for some of your plants. And so that might be really useful if you've purchased or if you've installed a plant recently. You know, we had all this rain, it was really awesome, and then suddenly it got very, very hot and very, very dry. And so even a new plant that is a full sun plant, if it's new in the ground, it needs a little bit of care, it needs a little bit of help, and some of the help might be in the form of temporary shade. So that was a great article, Pam. Thank you for writing that. But we're asking anyone, if you've got any tips you would like to share, or hints or hacks, please sign up. Now, if you're in the room, Pam's got a sign-up sheet. And what we need is your name, a complete description of your tip, hint, or hack. And if you've got any photos, that would be awesome. So you can reach out to Pam here, or you can reach out to sanantonio@npsot.org. Now, before I go to the talking about our next chapter meeting, I do have an announcement about a community involvement session that's happening on July 22nd. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for this. This was just brought to me here. But it is for the Westside Creek's Ecosystem Restoration Project. It's at about 30% design right now, and they're looking for community input. And so the involvement session is July 22nd from 9 a.m. until noon at Tafoya Middle School Cafeteria. And that's at 1303 West Cesar E. Chavez Boulevard. So please consider putting your input in at that community meeting. Okay, so our next chapter meeting is July 27th, and the title is You Are What You Eat, Dining from a Bee's Perspective with Mark DeKowit. I hope I said his name correctly. That should be a good one. And for tonight's presentation, we do have SAWS Water Saver Rewards points available. You can, now anyone in the room, you do not need this. You just need to sign in on the actual SAWS form. You do not need to take the quiz if you're in this room, but you do need to fill out the form that somebody has here over there at the table, registration table. If you are joining us from Zoom, you do need to take the quiz to prove that you were here and paying attention. So you can take a photo of that QR code. It'll take you right to the quiz, or you can go directly to that link that's listed at the bottom, surveymonkey.com/r/NPSOT butterflies of bear. And you'll want to do that right after the presentation because it closes at midnight and the information will be fresh and there's only a few questions. Okay, and for the moment everybody's been waiting for, tonight's presentation. We've got Butterflies of Bexar County with Zachary Tonzetich. And please bear with us as we've just transitioned to his presentation. Thanks again so much for joining us.
Mm-hmm. 1 second, let me move. Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. As Lee mentioned, my name is Zachary Tonzetich. I'm not a native Texan, but I've been living in Texas now for about 13 years. I moved down here in 2010 to take a job at the University of Texas in San Antonio. So my profession is actually chemistry. I'm a chemistry professor at the university. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is a developing passion of mine, one I've gotten into since moving down here to Texas. I started with birds, and that evolved into a more general interest in all of nature, including butterflies, which I'm going to talk about tonight. But I'm by no means an expert in the area. I'm going to just take you through some of my adventures in butterflying, provide some information about butterflies, and I tried to work in some information, or at least highlight some of our native plants when they occur in my photographs tonight. Okay. All right. So let's see here. There we go. To begin, I just want to acknowledge a few individuals who've been instrumental in my development as a butterflyer. These people right here, Ken Butler, Terry Doyle, Martin Reed, and I think many of you probably know Patty Pastor, are excellent and very knowledgeable in many things, birds, plants, and butterflies in particular. And they've really helped me to learn the various species and families that we're going to talk about tonight. In addition to that, these are two good friends of mine, Christian and Wendell, who've often accompanied me on butterflying adventures, both here in Bexar County and really around Texas. Okay? And also, I always like to acknowledge, with a picture of Texas lantana here, the efforts of societies such as yourselves, who really help to advance native plants and habitat for all of our wildlife. Without your efforts, certainly we wouldn't be able to observe the variety of species that we get to. All right, so let's begin with kind of the simplest question, and that is, what is a butterfly? And I have here some basic taxonomy. I know many of you are probably very interested in that, given the nature of the quizzes we saw before the meeting. And to answer the question, what is a butterfly? We'll consider, first of all, that it's an arthropod, okay? And it belongs to the class of animals we refer to as insects, okay? No surprise there. But then what a butterfly actually is one of a member of 6 families that belong to the order Lepidoptera. Okay? And of course, they share that ordering with moths, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about how we differentiate butterflies and moths. Now, here I have written down the 6 families of butterflies that we usually think about. And of course, if you count carefully, you'll see there's actually a 7th there. So the one I have in yellow is not found in North America. It's the so-called American moth butterflies. And they've recently been considered in addition to the order, or into the classification of butterflies, although it's not something we're going to encounter here, certainly in Texas. So we have 6 families of butterflies, and we're going to talk about each of these tonight, and I'm going to show you some examples of photographs of these species that I've taken. Here I'm showing you one pretty exotic species. This is a zebra longwing butterfly, and I actually just photographed this about 2 weeks ago at the San Antonio Botanical Garden during a butterfly survey. Okay, so we'll talk about where that fits in as we go along tonight. And I apologize for the placement of this Zoom bar. This is always something that gets in the way, but it's just repeating here that these butterflies comprise 6 families within that order Lepidoptera. Okay? Now, those 6 families are often grouped together in a superfamily, and this is what we would know scientifically as a butterfly, the Papilionoidea. This is the superfamily comprising the 6 families of Lepidoptera that we refer to as butterflies. Now, the next question we might encounter, where do butterflies come from? So this is based on some relatively recent research that was just published in the last few months. It got some press and media. I think it was featured on Science Friday, if anybody listens to that on NPR. But this work, which was in phylogenetics, demonstrated that butterflies first evolved about 100 million years ago when they diverged from moths and became day-flying. They became diurnal as opposed to predominantly nocturnal. And what was also interesting as I was looking through this is that all but one of the 6 extant butterfly families, so all the 6 families that exist now, actually predate the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, which means most butterfly families that we see today are older, or at least as old, I should say, as the dinosaurs, okay, to give you some perspective. This recent research that I just mentioned finds that butterflies likely originated in the Americas, and in fact, it's believed they originated in this part of the American continents, okay, before colonizing the rest of the world. So in many respects, butterflies, interestingly enough, are kind of the ultimate native insect because they first kind of evolved and then colonized the world from this region of the Americas. Now, interestingly enough, these earliest butterflies were likely to first fed on plants in the Fabaceae family, so legumes, no surprise there. As we look at some photographs of butterflies tonight, I try to point out some of the larval host plants for the species, and you'll see that many times legumes are the plant of choice for butterfly larvae. Now, I mentioned that butterflies share a grouping with moths in the order Lepidoptera. And as we start to think about observing and ultimately identifying butterflies, one of the first challenges we might encounter is how to differentiate a moth from a butterfly, right? I mean, they are in the same order after all. So what can we look at if we're photographing or observing butterflies that tells us that they're not moths? Okay? And I should also mention that, we have 6 butterfly families, but we have well over 100 family of moths. Okay? So the vast majority of the members of the order Lepidoptera are moths. Butterflies are actually a very small number, comprising about 12,000 or so species, okay, versus hundreds of thousands of species of moths. So when we want to differentiate moths and butterflies, these are some useful clues that we can look for if we have photographs or if we're observing them in the field. The first is antenna. Okay? So butterflies actually have slender antenna with a club or a hook at the end. And this is different from moths, which either have hairy antenna or filamentous antenna that don't terminate in a club or a hook. We can, of course, look at wing coloration. This is probably the least reliable field mark, but we associate butterfly wings with a lot of bright colored patterns. Okay, so if we see a bright patterned lepidopteran, we probably assume it's a butterfly. Activity, which I've already kind of alluded to. Butterflies are, of course, diurnal. They're active in the daytime, whereas moths are typically either nocturnal or crepuscular. Okay, we look for moths at night. Another good field mark is the resting posture. So butterflies often perch with the wings folded up, okay, or back, up or flat, whereas moths are capable of folding the wings back. And we're going to look at examples of all this now in a second. Okay? So let's begin with the antenna. Here I'm showing you 2 pictures of Lepidoptera. One is a butterfly, one is a moth. I purposely chose a butterfly that's not super colorful, so it's not unreasonable to maybe mistake this for a moth. But the Lepidopteran on the left is a Texas powdered skipper. This is one of our native butterflies, as you could probably guess from the name. And on the right, we have a moth. This is a geometer moth called a swag-lined wave. Okay? Now, you'll notice that in terms of the wing posture, they're the same here. The wings are basically open, okay? And so what we're going to look at in this image are the antennal clubs, okay, or the antennae, excuse me. So in our butterfly, our Texas powdered skipper here, you can see that the antenna terminates in a hook, okay? Whereas in our moth here, the antenna doesn't terminate in any type of feature, it's simply long and filamentous. Okay, so that's one way we can distinguish a butterfly on the left from the moth on the right, okay? Hooked antenna versus an unclubbed antenna. I also mentioned resting posture, okay? This is often one of the best clues to separate moths from butterflies, depending on the type of moth, I should say. So in this case, on the left, again, we have a butterfly. This is a juniper hair streak. This is one of the, I would say, more popular butterflies that we can find here in Bexar County. We'll talk more about this later. And on the right, we have an Arab moth, the indomitable graphic moth, okay? Now, if we look at the wings here, we can see that in the case of the juniper hair streak, these are folded up, okay? So with the butterfly, we can either be completely flat or we can be up. But in the case of the moth, much like a bird, it's able to fold its wings back, okay, almost tuck them away. So from that type of resting posture alone, we can tell that this must be a moth because the wings are folded back, whereas on our hair streak here, the wings are folded up, which is typical for a butterfly, and even more so typical for this subfamily of butterflies called hair streaks. Okay? And finally, I'll mention wing color. And again, I said this was one of the least reliable field marks because it turns out there are some pretty vibrant looking moths as well. On the left here, we have another photograph that I just took recently. This is the red-spotted admiral. And what we're looking at is actually a subspecies referred to as the red-spotted purple. This is one of the most sought after butterflies in the United States. It's gorgeous. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. It has these vibrant blue colors. The underwing pattern is also very interesting. We'll look at that later. This is, of course, a butterfly. But on the right, we have a moth. This is a hieroglyphic moth, but it also shows very colorful patterned wings. Okay? So this is to point out that in this case, looking at wing color, okay, is not necessarily a reliable field mark to differentiate the butterfly from the moth. Now, if we fall back on some of our other characteristics we've talked about, if you look closely at the antennal clubs of the red-spotted admiral, they are in fact clubbed. We can't really see the antenna on the moth here. They're kind of pinned against its body here, against its folded up wings, but they're of course filamentous. And again, if we look at the resting posture, okay, here we have them folded back, here we have them open. Okay, so again, this all tells us that this is a butterfly and this is a moth. Now, the brilliant colors we see for both moths and butterflies actually originate from scales. Okay, so these are the wings and the body, part of the body of Lepidoptera are covered with small scales. Okay, and this gives rise to the colors that we observe either through pigmentation in the scales or through what we call structural color. That is, we create nanostructures, very small structures that diffract and reflect light in certain ways, giving rise to these brilliant colors. And this is very similar to the way that color is observed in bird feathers. Okay, we have both pigment and we have structural coloration. All right, now, with that little introduction to moths versus butterflies, let's focus now on the topic for this evening, which is butterflies. I think many of you are aware that, like many insects, butterflies go through several stages in their life cycle, involving metamorphosis from one stage to another. And in the case of butterflies, we have the egg, the larval stage, the pupal stage, and of course the adult, which we associate with the flying butterfly. I'm going to show you a series of images I captured on the Salado Creek Greenway behind my home, actually not too far from here. Most of these are from a single species that I followed from egg through adult, so to speak, except for the pupal form. I could never find the chrysalis, so I substituted it with that of a different species. But here we have an example of a butterfly egg. In this case, it was laid on some common hop tree, Tilia trifoliata, I believe. This is quite abundant on the Greenway and is the host plant, as we'll talk about, for several types of butterflies. So there we have an example of the egg. Here we have an example of the larval form, which we often know as caterpillars. This is what we refer to as an early instar caterpillar. That means it's very early in the larval stage. Okay, it's a young caterpillar. This is the same species now, a week or two later, and we can see it's changed color and changed appearance. This is now the larval form in a mid-instar, and you can see it's chewing up that hop tree leaf. Okay. About a week later, it's again changed colors and gotten bigger. It's now almost ready to pupate. Okay. Now, of course, at that time, the butterfly larval will form a chrysalis and enter the pupal stage. This is not the pupal, or not the chrysalis, excuse me, for the species here. I couldn't find it. These are often difficult to find. But this is an example of a butterfly chrysalis, I think on mealy blue sage here. Okay? And then finally, we get the adult form, a process we call eclosing, where the adult emerges from the chrysalis. And what we have here is a species called a two-tailed swallowtail. In this case, it's perched on some peacock flower or Pride of Barbados, nectaring in this case. So here we see an example of the various life stages that we have for butterflies. Now, how about a quick word about anatomy? Okay, so I'm going to show you some images of some butterflies and point out some key aspects of their anatomy here. Here we have an example of a giant swallowtail butterfly, nectaring from some Texas lantana. Like many insects, it's got a segmented body containing an abdomen, a thorax, and a head. The wings, of course, are attached to the thorax. We have 3 sets of legs, so 6 legs total. We have these beautiful compound eyes that allow the butterfly to sense its environment, along with this antenna right here, which we've already talked about. And of course, we have this tongue, this proboscis, that the butterfly uses to glean nectar, as well as minerals and other substances from the environment. Okay? So that's kind of the gross anatomy of the butterfly. For those of you who have some more experience with identifying butterflies, this is a further description of some of the parts of the butterfly that we might use for identification. So in this image, I'm showing you an example of a soldier butterfly. This is related to the more familiar monarch and queen butterflies that we'll mention later. Here it's nectaring from some mist flower. And you can see we have 2 sets of wings, the forewing and the hind wing, which we often abbreviate as such. And then within the wings, we can refer to various parts, okay, by some of the nomenclature shown here. And this is useful if we want to identify markings on the wings, patterns, and so forth that aid in identification. So you'll see I've labeled here things called cells. These are partitions of the wing that are bounded by these veins in black shown here. And in certain species, these cells can contain markings. So this is one way to refer to the part of the wing. We have the margins of the wing. The leading margin is called the costal margin, and the trailing margin we might call the outer margin. And again, we can have patterning that occurs close to the margin or right up to the margin, which can be useful. The point of the forewing we refer to as the apex. Again, a nice kind of way to describe where various features might occur. And then for the larger features of the wing, we have these designations shown here. So the area of the wing closest to the body, we call the base. The middle of the wing, we call the median. We can then talk about the post-median, the submargin, and of course the margin. Okay, so if you get into looking at butterflies, or if you have a field guide and you see things that say spotting on the outer margin, or patterns on the submarginal area, these are the terms that they're referring to in those cases. Okay. Yes.
So on the hind wing, do you use that same terminology?
You can use the same terminology on the hind wing, but oftentimes the hind wing can be obscured just because of the resting posture of the butterfly. So absolutely, we can talk about cells, we can talk about margins and median areas and submargins on the hind wing as well, but oftentimes there's kind of a focus on the forewing. But yes, those same terms apply, absolutely. All right, so many of you are aware that butterflies are pollinators, and that's because they seek out flowering plants as a nectar source. Okay, so we usually associate butterflies with flower nectar. But butterflies also glean nutrients from a variety of other sources, including mud, fruit, aphid honeydew, tree sap, and many other things as well. So here we see a picture of a gray hair-streaked butterfly. This is a very common native butterfly on most of our favorite plant here, antelope horn milkweed. And of course, this is gleaning nectar from the milkweed plant. But it's also common to find butterflies, such as these common streaky skippers, in the presence of a mud puddle. Okay, in this case, we call this behavior mudding, just like we call this behavior nectaring. And in this case, the butterflies are gleaning minerals predominantly from that mud. Now, in the absence of a good mud patch, butterflies may also opt for some less savory substrates. So it's also not uncommon to see butterflies flocking animal droppings as well. And here we see a series of little yellow butterflies, a bordered patch, and a crescent, all on one piece of dog drop. Okay. Now, of course, these are adult butterflies, but the other life stages of butterflies are also intimately connected with plant species. And these can serve as larval hosts, as egg hosts, and as pupal hosts for the butterflies. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about larval foods. So with butterflies, we can find that certain species are really specialists when it comes to the plant they desire their larval forms to eat, and others are more generalists. Okay? And of course, this close relationship between butterflies and plants is perhaps the most pronounced in the larval form, much more so than in the adult forms, where adult butterflies tend to visit many types of plants. Okay? And butterfly larvae in general will consume plant matter. This includes not only leaves, but flowers and perhaps the fruits of the plant as well. And as I just mentioned, some butterflies will use only one species of plant, while others may use several from a given genus, family, or even multiple families. So by way of an example here, here's a relatively uncommon butterfly that can be found in Bexar County. This is the soapberry hairstreak. Okay, and the larval host, and the only larval host for this butterfly, is western soapberry. Okay, so sorry it's cut off there. Now, we can contrast that with the closely related gray hairstreak. These are in the same subfamily. But in the case of the gray hairstreak, this has been observed to have the larval eat up to 30 different plant families. Okay, so the larva can use plants in up to 30 different families. So that's quite a difference for relatively closely related butterflies. Now, of course, even though it's been observed to use up to 30 families, by and large, the gray hairstreak prefers both legumes or mallows. Okay, so that's typically where we might find gray hairstreak larvae. Now, before we get into some of the photographs here, I just want to mention a few things about Bexar County. So as you're all aware, because you do many nice field trips, the parks around Bexar Counties, the greenways, and the natural areas offer great opportunities for wildlife viewing, and of course, butterflies are absolutely no exception to that. I've been to many of the green spaces around the city, in the county, to compile all the butterflies I've seen since I've been looking for butterflies, and it's really a beautiful resource that we have here in the San Antonio area. Now, in terms of observing butterflies in the county, they fly year-round here because of our climate, so you can see them every month of the year. I have butterfly records from January, February, and all the warmer months as well. Okay. That being said, certainly the most active time is April through November, with October and November probably being the best time to see butterflies because that's given time for species to move up from southern Texas. So we tend to see a larger variety during those 2 months. Okay. Now, where do we begin when we look at butterflies? Well, my first serious study of butterflies simply began in my yard. I used to live in Helotes. I now live closer to here. But I used to live in Helotes. And during that time, I took advantage of SAW's Water Saver program. I think we have some representatives from the San Antonio water system here. That was really a great program that allowed me to remove large amounts of turf grass in my yard, put down native plant beds, and as a result, I was able to record 50 different species just in my yard in Helotes. Okay? And that included some relatively rare species as well. Okay? Now, people will probably ask, well, how many species have you seen in Bexar County? I've seen 113 species. Actually, I've seen 114, but I've photographed 113. Okay. I'm not going to show you all 113 tonight, don't worry. Okay. And that's a relatively large number. And that's the reason that's possible is, as many of you know, Bexar County sits at the confluence of several ecological regions of Texas. And this type of habitat diversity is great for many things, plants, of course, birds, which is my first interest, and also butterflies. Okay. So the fact that we have, hill country in the northwest part of the county, we have blackland prairie, and we even have some of the South Texas thorn scrub. This allows us to see a great diversity of species, which really makes Bexar County special. And of course, I mentioned we have 6 families of butterflies. They're all well represented with several species in Bexar County, and we're going to talk about each of those tonight as I show you some examples. Okay. All right. So I'll start by talking about the swallowtail family of butterflies. This actually includes another type of butterfly called a Parnassian, which is not found in Texas. It's found in more northern climates. But the swallowtails you've probably encountered before. These are large butterflies, and they're named for the tail-like projections that we see on the hindwing. Okay. Members of this family found in our area are generally going to be either predominantly yellow in color or black in color, with striping or spotting on both the forewing and the hindwing. And they're quite large. They're very hard to miss. The other aspect about swallowtails that's interesting is that their caterpillars are pretty conspicuous as well as far as caterpillars go. These are relatively large and easy to observe. Here we have some examples of swallowtail caterpillars. On the left, we have the black swallowtail. And this image, well, I'll get to it in a minute. I'll tell you about the plant in a second. In the middle, we have the pipevine swallowtail. And on the right, we have the species we've already encountered tonight. This is the two-tailed swallowtail. Now, I included this image. It's on the same hop tree because it shows you a unique anatomical feature of the swallowtail larva. This is the osmeterium. So this is a fleshy organ that the larval form can inflate as a defense mechanism if there's predators around. Okay, so this horn-like appendage is unique to swallowtail caterpillars. Now, I showed you I'd mentioned the plants. So this is, I think the common name is Dutchman's breeches. This is a plant in the Rutaceae family, which is one of the plant families that the black swallowtail uses. And on the right, of course, we have, once again, our common hop tree, which this two-tailed swallowtail prefers. Looking at some of the adult forms, we'll start with the more darkly colored swallowtails. On the left, we have the adult form of the pipevine. This is one of the most common butterflies you'll encounter in Bexar County. It's so named because the larvae use Aristolochia species, pipevines, as their larval hosts. Okay. In the middle, we have the adult form of the black swallowtail. Here, actually, in all 3 images, are we on lantana? No, I guess we're on some peacock flower in the middle. But again, these images are also nice because they show you the beautiful pollen that's been splayed out on the butterfly wings, again, kind of illustrating why these are such great pollinators. So the black swallowtail I mentioned will use plants in the Rutaceae family, but also carrots as well, Apiaceae, as its hosts. Okay? And on the right, we actually have the dark form of the eastern tiger swallowtail. I'm going to show you the light form in a minute. And this species uses plants from multiple families for its larval hosts. Here we have the lighter colored or tiger swallowtails. On the left is the eastern tiger. So this is the same species that I just showed you right here. This is a female. Okay. This is a male, but not all females adopt that black form. Only females can adopt it, okay, but not all do. So this is a case where we have 2 different color morphs for this species of butterfly. And on the right, we have the very similar looking, again, two-tailed swallowtail. So you can see, again, these look very similar. And like many things, like plants, no need to tell this audience, it takes getting familiar with many of the field marks to be able to differentiate these species in the field. All right, moving on from the swallowtails, here we have the next family we'll look at, which is the Pieridae. These we refer to as the white, yellow, and sulfur butterflies. Okay? So butterflies in this family range from pretty small to quite large, okay, unlike the swallowtails, which are mostly uniformly large. And they tend to be monochromatic in color. So they tend to be mostly just white or yellow or orange, okay? So that's kind of what gives rise to the common name. Now, in our area, species that belong to this family are found in one of two subfamilies, the whites, the Pieridae, and the yellows and the sulfurs, okay? So here we have some examples of butterflies in these subfamilies, and we'll look at some more in a minute. But what we find is that the whites, the Pieridae, they typically use mustards, Brassicaceae, as their host plants, whereas the yellows and sulfurs favor legumes, Fabaceae. Okay? So here's some examples from the subfamilies. This is the checkered white butterfly. This is our most common white butterfly that we find in Bexar County. Here we have a dainty sulfur butterfly, another common yellow. Okay, this is a very small butterfly. And the sleepy orange. This is one of the most common butterflies you might encounter along walks. Okay, I actually took this image in in January, which you might recognize because it was actually nectaring from some henbit dead nettle, which is a non-native plant, of course. And this is about a medium-sized butterfly. Okay, so we kind of get the whole gamut of sizes in this family. In terms of other whites that are possible to encounter in the county, on the left is one of my favorites. This is the falcate orange tip. So this is a white butterfly that belongs to a tribe of butterflies called marbles because of this really intricate patterning on the underside of the hind wing. These only fly from about early March to early April. That's your only chance to see them in this region. So it's really a treat if you get to see one. And on the right, we have a photograph that I didn't take in Bexar County. It's the only one, I promise. This is the cabbage white butterfly. This can be found in Bexar County, although it's very rare. However, in the rest of the United States, this is one of the most common butterflies. And the interesting aspect of it is it's not native. It's one of the few non-native butterflies on the continent. So the cabbage white, as it says here, was introduced accidentally to Quebec, to the province of Quebec, in 1860, and it subsequently spread throughout the continent. Okay, so I'm yet to observe this in Bexar County. I took this image in my parents' front yard in Pennsylvania, where there's many of these, but I still haven't found this species yet in Bexar County. Okay? So when it comes to whites, the really only choices we'll find here in the county are the falcate orange tip and the checkered white I showed you on the previous slide. Here are some examples of common yellows we might encounter in the county. On the left, we have the little yellow. Okay, this is a relatively diminutive butterfly. It's not quite as small as the dainty sulfur, but it's fairly small. On the right, here, if we jump over, we have the orange sulfur. This is another very common butterfly. It often flies in some colder months as well, colder weather months. And in the middle, we have a larger butterfly. This is the southern dogface. Okay? So you might say, why is this called a dogface? This is actually a term that's used quite a bit in this family of butterflies. Well, to answer that, you have to look at the top side of the wings, which is very difficult with this family, well, this subfamily of butterflies, the yellows. I was able with my cell phone when I lived in Helotes to snap this picture as it opened the wings. And the reason this is called a dog face is because this pattern, if you look closely, that's outlined on the forewing here, resembles a dog. Here's the snout, here's the eye, and that's why we call it the southern dog face. Okay. Here's some examples of some much larger members of the subfamily. These are called large sulfurs in the genus Phoebus. On the left, we have the large orange sulfur, not a very creative name. And on the right, we have the cloudless sulfur. And I'm showing you these images because this brings up another aspect of butterflies, which is that males and females can sometimes, not always, look very different. Okay? So here's the female form of the large orange sulfur, and you can see it's much more highly patterned than that of the male. And that's true for the cloudless sulfur as well, much more highly patterned. So this is an example of what we refer to as sexual dimorphism, okay, where the males and the females can look very different. This is, of course, can be common in bird species, which I'm more familiar with, but we also see it in certain species of butterflies as well. Okay. All right, we'll move on to the next family, which is the gossamer winged butterflies. So members of this family are small and delicate, as you might imagine from the name. In our region, we only have 2 of the 3 subfamilies of the gossamer wings. We have the blues and we have the hair streaks. There's a 3rd subfamily, the coppers, which are found in more northern climates. I was able to photograph my first example last summer when I was in Rhode Island. But here we only have these 2 subfamilies, the blues and the hair streaks. So the blues are named because of the color on the top side of their wings. Here's an example of a species that's called Riekert's blue. And you can see we've got more or less uniform blue color on the top side of the wings. Now, these are very difficult to identify from what we call dorsal images like this. However, if we get a photograph of the underside of the wing, which is not too difficult, they have much finer distinctive markings that we can use in identification. Okay, so that's one subfamily. The other, of course, is the hair streaks. This is my favorite grouping of butterflies. Okay, these are my favorites. These can adopt different colors. Okay, there's actually quite a variety, especially in the tropics. And they contain these hair-like projections on the hind wing. You can see here, this is our gray hair streak. Okay, and these are meant to confuse predators because they look like what? They look like antennae, right? So when the dragonfly comes by and takes a big chomp out of the butterfly, it's not killing it by biting its head off. It's just taking off some of the backside of the hind wing. Okay, so that's the hair streak butterfly. So let's look at some examples of blues that we find in our area. These are more or less the common blues that we find here. We have several species. If we look at them quickly, they almost look identical. This is some of the challenge in getting to recognize these species. This is the Cassius blue, the Riekert's blue, the marine blue, Cyrinus blue, not Cassius, Cyrinus blue, Riekert's blue, marine blue, and Cassius blue. Okay. The other member of the blues that we have here is the Western pygmy blue. And this is an interesting butterfly because it's the smallest in North America. Okay, this is the smallest butterfly in North America with a wingspan as small as 12 millimeters. So very small butterfly, can be difficult to find sometimes, but it has this beautiful coloration, this copper coloring in the wings that we don't find in some of the more typical blues. Here are some examples of common hair streaks we find in the county. We've already talked at length about the gray hair streak. In the middle, we have the mallow scrub hair streak, so named because its larval hosts, of course, use Malvaceae. And on the right, we have, again, one of the most popular butterflies to encounter. This is the great purple hair streak. It's a very striking species. Of course, the base color is purple. We have these iridescent blues. It's a really striking species to see. I also think it's interesting because its larvae use mistletoe as a host plant. Mistletoe, okay? Which I'm not sure many other Lepidoptera use. Okay? Now, unlike the blues, which by and large use legumes as the host plants, the hair streaks use, quite a variety of different plants. We've already looked at soapberry. Now we have mallows. We have the very promiscuous gray hair streak, which uses many families. And of course, we have these mistletoes as well. Here's some further examples of hair streaks. Here's the juniper hair streak we saw near the beginning. Okay, not surprisingly, its host plant are juniper species, ash juniper, of course, here in the county. And on the right, we have one of my favorites. This is a butterfly that's named the Henry's elfin. Okay? So it's reported that this uses, what is this, redbud, right? Although I've never found a caterpillar on that plant. It's also known to use hollies, and you can't see it here, but I had the scientific name for possum haw written down here. I'm hoping to find some examples of these caterpillars on possum haw as well. But I think for the most part, they probably use the Texas or the Eastern redbud here in the county as their local hosts. Now, interestingly enough, as I was walking around campus one day, I was able to observe a juniper hair streak oviposit or lay this egg onto some ash juniper. Okay, and as you imagine, this was very tiny. So it took some effort to get this photograph. Let me circle it there for you. But this white orb here is actually a juniper hair streak egg laid on the juniper. Okay. Oh, I want to say that was probably in April. Yeah. All right. So moving on, we now have this kind of more cryptic family of butterflies. This is the metal marks. Okay, this is the family that we have the fewest members of that are found in the county. We only have 4 members. I've only seen 3 here, although I've seen the 4th member in Bandera County. Okay, the metal marks are very small, even smaller than most of the hair streaks, and they have very delicate patterning as well. And they're so named because of these fine metallic markings that we see on the wings. Okay, so we'll look at those here in a second. 2 members of this family are fairly common in Bexar County. That's the the fatal metal mark and the rounded metal mark. Okay, you can see here that the host plant for the fatal metal mark is old man's beard or Texas virgin bower, Clematis drummondii. The rounded metal mark uses shrubby bone set. Got cut off here, and I can't remember the scientific name off the top of my head. These 2 are fairly common in the county. They can be seen most times of the year. They're very similar looking, so it takes some training to differentiate them. And on the right, we have a rarer species that shows up in certain years. This is the red bordered metal. Okay, this is more common in South Texas. The host plant is spiny hackberry. Okay, but this can show up in the county in certain years. The 4th member is a species called the Rawson's metal mark, which I'm yet to find, although I have recorded it to the west of them. So very few members in that family. All right. Now, getting towards our final 2 families, these are going to be the biggest families. Next, we come to the brushfoots. Okay, so the brushfoot or the Nymphalidae are kind of the epitome of butterflies. When you think of a butterfly, or if you've seen pictures of butterflies, you've probably seen a brushfoot, maybe a swallowtail. Okay, this is the largest family, although not the largest represented in Bexar County, within the superfamily of butterflies. These are generally medium to large size butterflies, and they're awfully brightly colored in patterns. Okay, very striking much of the time. The name comes from the fact that most of the members of this family have reduced forelegs. So they have basically, they appear to be 4-legged instead of 6-legged. Okay? And in certain cases, those reduced forelegs actually have brush-like hair. So that's why we get the name brushfoots, the common name. Okay? And as I've mentioned, many of our most familiar species, i.e. the monarch, belong to this family. Okay? So let's start there with the milkweed butterflies. Okay? Here we have 2 of the examples of milkweed butterfly that we find in the county, 2 of the 3. Okay? And in both cases, I captured the caterpillars on antelope horn milkweed, okay, Asclepias ferula. Now, when I first started looking for milkweed butterflies, I assumed that their larval stages had to use milkweeds in this genus, okay, kind of true milkweeds, if you will. I later learned that they can really use any member of the milkweed subfamily, including milk vines. And this spring, I was actually able to photograph a monarch egg that was laid on some Taliote. Okay, so it's not just the Asclepias milkweeds that these species can use as hosts, it's really anything in the milkweed subfamily. Okay? So question is, what are the milkweed butterflies we're looking at here? Okay, the one on the left, whoops, my image is gone, there we go. The one on the left is the monarch, okay, probably the standard bearer for butterflies in general. And on the one on the right is another example of a milkweed butterfly that's found very commonly here. In fact, I would argue this is probably more abundant than the monarch. This is the queen butterfly. Okay? And again, these can look pretty similar when you're getting started, but there are some differences when you really start looking at it. The 3rd member of this subfamily I showed you earlier is the soldier butterfly. That's a much less common butterfly to find here, but it can show up in certain years. Okay? Now, I felt the need, because of my profession, to make a quick diversion and talk a little bit about chemistry. Okay? And hopefully, since we're plant people here, you'll appreciate this. So many of you are aware that milkweeds will exude this white milky latex when the plant's damaged. Moreover, members of the milkweed subfamily, and in fact, the family, the dogbane family in general, have this latex that's toxic. Okay? Now, from a chemistry standpoint, it's interesting to interrogate what's actually in this substance. Plants are actually a beautiful, okay, a beautiful organism in terms of the types and variety of chemical compounds they produce. And many of my colleagues at the university study these interesting natural products that are only produced in plants. Okay? In the case of milkweeds, the compound of interest here is referred to as a cardiac glycoside that goes by the name of a cardenolide, okay, or cardenolide. This is the compound in the milkweed latex that causes toxicity. And it does so by inhibiting enzymes such as the sodium-potassium ATPase, which are critical for organisms, other insects, mammals and so forth in terms of life, and it can lead to cardiac arrest and other types of things. This is the origin of the toxicity in the milkweeds. It's these cardenolide compounds. Now, the milkweed butterflies have evolved to not only tolerate these cardenolides, but actually to sequester them in the larval form so that when they become adults, they get that protection of the toxicity against predators. Okay? And if you're interested, this is the chemical structure of one type of cardenolide called calotropin. Okay? It's composed of a steroidal unit shown on the right. This is the type of diagram I'm used to looking at day in and day out. And it's attached to the steroid is a sugar shown in orange there. Okay? So that's the nature of the compound we find specifically in antelope horn milkweed. Okay? This was based on a study here that looked at the composition of the cardenolides in antelope horn milkweed. Okay? All right, moving on from the milkweed butterflies, here's some more examples of brushfoots we find very common in the county. These are the fritillarian longwing butterflies. These will use passion flowers as their larval hosts. On the left, we have the Gulf fritillary. This is a beautiful orange butterfly. You'll probably see it. I'm sure there's many here right now in Harburger. In fact, I saw one of these on the walk-in from my car. And on the right, we have the variegated fritillary, another common butterfly. I was able to photograph the larval form on the greenway. This is on some bract passion flower, which is pretty common. In fact, at least on the northwest side of town, I've seen this passion flower more than other species. In addition to the longwings, this is another subfamily of the brushfoots, another common one you might encounter. These are the emperors. These all occur in a single genus in our area, Stereocompa, and we refer to them as hackberry butterflies because, of course, they use hackberries as their hosts. These are the two most common species we would encounter, the tawny emperor on the left and the hackberry emperor on the right. Some more examples of brushfoots. Here we have some more spectacular looking ones. These are the admirals. Okay, this is the subfamily of the admirals and allies. On the left, we have the viceroy butterfly, and on the right, we have, again, the red-spotted admiral. Now, these are very interesting because they bring up another aspect of butterfly evolution. So if I showed you this photo and you didn't look carefully, you would say that's what? A monarch butterfly, exactly. And I just told you monarch butterflies are toxic. So the viceroys evolved to mimic the monarch so it won't be eaten by predators. Okay? On the right, the red-spotted admirals employed the same strategy, but it's not mimicking the monarch. Does anybody recall what this is mimicking that I've showed you tonight? Pipevine swallowtail, exactly right. Okay? Pipevines are also toxic because they sequester aristolic acid, okay, in their larval forms. And so the red-spotted admirals evolved to mimic the pipevine. Okay, so these are some nice examples of mimicry. See, and they're the mimics that it's showing. A couple more examples of brushfoots. These are what we call checker spots and allies. These are what we sometimes call the true brushfoots. These are the brushfoots that have those brush-like hairs on the reduced forelegs. This is the largest subfamily that we'd find in Bexar County. Here's some examples that you may encounter. On the left, we have the American lady, and on the right, we have the painted lady. Okay? And again, these look very similar. So oftentimes with butterflies, it's also good to get what we call ventral images, so the underwing. And you can see here, these are brilliantly patterned underneath the wing. And in the case of the American lady, we have 2 of these eye spots on the hind wing, but we have 4 on the painted lady. Okay? So these are the things we learn to identify in the field as we get more familiar. Here's some other examples of true brushfoots. This is a very common one, the common buckeye, okay, that you might encounter. And on the right, we have a pretty spectacular one. This is called the question mark. It's an example of what we call a comma butterfly. And it's named because if you're able to get a ventral image, it's got this silvery marking that resembles a question mark. Okay, that's how that butterfly, at least the common name, arises. Okay? And finally, the last brushfoot I'll mention is one that you've probably encountered. It gets a bad reputation, although unearned, and it's the American snout butterfly. Okay? And the reason people may not like these is they're a little bit ugly, right? If you compare this to the red-spotted admiral, it's not going to win any beauty contests. The palps, which are kind of mouth parts, are elongated in the snout to give it its characteristic appendage there. And what this is most known for are huge migratory movements in certain years. So you probably have recalled a time where you've seen thousands of these on the wing, Your car probably took out 1,000 of them, didn't even make a dent in the population. But these can have huge migratory movements in certain years, and their host plant is also hackberry. All right, so we're coming now to the end. This is the last family I'll mention. These are the skippers, okay? So much like brushfoots, these are a large, diverse family. These are the most represented in Bexar County. Members of this group are typically small. For the most part, they're quite small, and they have quick dart-like flight, which gives rise to the name skipper. The antennae of the skippers, the Hesperids, are frequently hooked at the ends as opposed to clubbed, as in many of the other species we looked at. And in our area, we have 3 subfamilies: the grass skippers, exemplified by the southern broken dash, and of course, the larvae of this subfamily use grasses. We have the spread wing skippers, exemplified by this common streaky skipper that tend to perch with the wings open. And we have the dicot skippers, okay, exemplified here by a long-tailed skipper. So here's some examples of grass skippers. You can see they're all small, well, you can't really gauge size, but they're relatively dull. They're yellow or brown, okay? They're small in size, and they tend to perch with the wings up like this, okay? And unlike all the other butterflies we looked at tonight, they can't really perch with the wings completely open. The best they can do is this kind of jet-like or fighter jet-like posture right here, where the forewings are kind of perpendicular to the hind wings. The hind wings are back, the forewings are up. So these are the grass skippers. This is a collection of some of the species you might encounter here in Bexar County. Here's some examples of spread wing skippers. These are both dusky wings that I just happened to choose because I like the photos. On the left, we have the Horace's dusky wing, and on the right, we have the funereal dusky wing. And as I've already mentioned, this subfamily tends to perch with those wings beautifully spread open. So they're very photogenic compared to the grass skippers. Okay? And the final subfamily, this is my favorite subfamily of skippers, are the dicot skippers. Okay? These use, of course, broadleaf plants as their larval hosts as opposed to grasses like the grass skippers. On the left, we have the northern cloudy wing. This is a pretty common butterfly that we find here. And on the right, we have the white striped longtail. Okay, this is one of my favorite photographs I've ever taken. I entered it into the North American Butterfly Association's photo contest last year. It didn't win, which I thought was a crime based on who won, but that's all right. All right, so that's just a collection of some of the butterflies that I've encountered. It's by no means exhaustive, but I think it gives kind of a nice overview of some of the species we have here in Bexar County. And I just want to end with a few observations and comments about butterfly watching and kind of how to get into it. So, you know, it's accessible to anyone, okay? And what's great about it is your own yard is the best place to start, right? The first task is to identify all the species in your yard. If you've put in native plants, flowering plants, believe me, you will have a nice collection of butterflies, certainly in the fall months. Binoculars can be useful, okay? But if you use them, it's good to look for close focus binoculars because unlike birds, we tend to be in much closer proximity to butterflies when we're observing them. Photography is great with butterflies compared to bird photography, which I'm not very good at. I think it's relatively easier. The other great thing about it is photos can really help you aid in learning species, right? Because you get a static image, you can focus in on various field marks, and that can be a good starting point in butterfly identification. Another great tool are butterfly counts. These are conducted several times a year. I'm doing one tomorrow up in Bernie. I did one 2 weeks ago at Love Creek in Bandera County. You're often paired with people who have different levels of experience, so you can learn from them. This is another great learning tool. And of course, although this is not relevant to this audience, it was certainly for me, butterflies are a great gateway into plant and pollinator study. Okay, so I don't know very much about native plants, but I'm learning. And by looking at butterflies and everything around me on my walks, this was really a great tool. Okay. A couple more things to mention. Many butterflies can look similar as we've seen tonight, so don't get discouraged if you can't identify them right away. Just like bird watching, which is my first pastime, behavioral clues, habitat, and seasonality can be important considerations. I told you certain species only fly at one time of the year. Okay. And also keep in mind that natural variation, both in size and appearance, as well as sexual dimorphism, occurs in butterflies. So here's an example of one species of butterfly, the bordered patch, a very common brushfoot. Here we have the male and the female. I think the female is actually larger. Okay, you can see the size difference. And here we have the same species, but it looks completely different. Okay? And this is all natural variation in the species. So to end, here's some resources I'd recommend. iNaturalist, which I think many of you probably use or familiar with, is just the most wonderful resource. This is my handle, nothing creative about that. If you'd like to follow me or if you want to tag me for help in the butterfly identifications, I'm more than happy to help out. This is the Butterflies and Moths of North America website. It's a great resource with information and photographs of different species. The North American Butterfly Association is an excellent organization. I'm a member. Okay, they're into butterfly conservation. And in fact, they put out a quarterly periodical that might be interesting to this audience, Butterfly Gardener. They have a regular magazine called American Butterflies, but they also have this as well, which is specific to gardening. In terms of field guides, the best one is this Swift Guide to Butterflies by Jeff Glassberg. I was actually lucky to meet Jeff Glassberg 2 years ago down in Mission, Texas at the National Butterfly Center. Even got to butterfly with him for a few minutes. These are some other guides as well. I'd highly recommend the Glassberg though. So with that, I just want to thank everybody, Joan, Don for inviting me here, Terry for help with everything, Lee for the introduction. I'm not supposed to say, there we go, thank you. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. I know I ran a little bit long. Professors have never been accused of being too brief. But if I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to now. Thanks. Yeah, Mara?
Yeah, there's no questions online right now?
Okay.
I'm just curious, what would be the explanation for Darwinian and
Why it's vestigial legs?
Why does Bexar County have so many of those for some reason?
Well, I don't think, yes, thank you, Lee. Yeah, so the question was, what is the evolutionary reason for the reduced forelegs in the brushfoot butterflies? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what advantage it would confer to the butterfly. But to your other question, the brushfoots are the most common family in general. So anywhere you look, they're going to be the most highly represented for the most part. We have a fair number here in Bexar County, but I would say in terms of the relative distributions among the families, it's pretty much going to be the same in most places. Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah, is that quotation you found of the origins, do you know which of the families?
Oh, good question.
Might be the most primitive or the first families?
So Jerry's question is, in the recent work on butterfly evolution, does it mention which of the families was the first to diverge from the moths to evolve? And the answer is, I have to be honest here, I didn't read the entire paper, okay? I read the abstract and parts of it. So I don't know if that was covered in the work in general. That is a great question. My guess is probably something akin to the skippers would be the first types of butterflies because they have a lot of characteristics that are kind of more in common with many of the moth families. But I don't know the answer to that, Jerry. It's a great question. It's available. I had the reference on the talk. You couldn't see it because the Zoom bar obscured it. But if you have a copy of it, it'll be on there. And I can email it to you.
I have a question.
Yes, Lee.
Why are the hair streaks your favorite butterfly?
Oh, the hair streaks are my favorite because I think their patternings are unique but understated as opposed to the brushfoots, right, which are all in your face with their patterns. And they can be difficult to find. They're not as abundant. You have to really look for them because they're smaller in stature. But, you know, I don't know if I can really put my finger on it. It's kind of an intangible why I like them the best, but they've kind of, you know, had the most prominent place in my interest, I guess, when it comes to butterflies.
We do have a question from Zoom.
Sure.
It is, where's your favorite place in Bexar County to search for butterflies?
Oh, great question. So the question is, where's my favorite place to look for butterflies? So the answer to that is twofold. One is on the new northern extension of the Salado Creek Greenway, which runs from 1604 up to Eisenhower Park. So I live in the Chavano Highlands neighborhood. We have a private entrance to the Greenway. So I often take my 4-year-old son on walks back there looking for butterflies. And the second place I love is UTSA's campus. So some of you have been to the UTSA's main campus, not too far from here. We have a large area of land. Much of it is untouched in the last 60 years since the university was settled there. So there's excellent native habitat there, mixed in with a lot of cultivated gardens, a lot of lantana and other things. And my colleague Wendell and I have recorded 90 species of butterfly on UTSA's campus, which is unbelievable. That's more than the botanical garden.
So can anybody go to the?
Yes and no. Parking is draconian in terms of the enforcement. But there's probably some spots on campus if you can find a place to park. Sure. I think, I don't think they would mind you looking,
So
walking around.
Saturday and Sunday would be best.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And again, I think where we found kind of the most interesting species have been in October, November, December.
Another question from Zoom. Is that a zebra longwing on the last slide? And if so, how common are they here and where are they usually found? Okay, so question is about some of the butterflies on this slide. So this is a collection of super, super rare butterflies that I've found in Bexar County. Some of these have been the first time they've ever been recorded in the county, or at least the first time they've ever been recorded on iNaturalist. This is the rarest one in the middle. This is a band-tailed sister. This is the northernmost record ever recorded for this species, which belongs to me. I found this at Government Canyon in 2018, I think it was. The question about the zebra longwing, that's this species here, okay? This is a species that can be found in somewhat decent numbers here, but it's highly variable year to year. It's killed off by freezes. So these hadn't appeared in the county in a couple of years. And then this year during a butterfly survey at the Botanical Garden, we found 2. They were found at some other sites, and I photographed one as well at Crown Ridge Canyon. So they can be relatively observable, but it can depend year to year. They're never common. So they're a treat when you get to see them. Yes, it's a longwing, so it uses passion flower. So I don't know specifically, I think it would use anything in the genus probably. Yeah.
So I saw several plants recurring in your slideshow. From your experience and the plants that you put in your yard, what are a handful of ones that are just constantly butterfly
visited? Yeah. So the question is, what plants we might put in the yard to get good butterfly action? So in terms of flowering plants that attract adults, the number one by far for me ever is lantana. I've seen more butterflies on lantana, not just Texas lantana, but the cultivated forms, than any other plant by far. Okay, lantana is definitely the hero.
Another question is,
Yeah.
what kind of cameras and photo techniques do you use?
I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, so lantana is number one. A popular one is the blue mist flower, Greg's blue mist. I find that brings in queen butterflies, but it's not great for anything else. I have some in my yard. Other species, mealy blue sage or some of the cultivated variants is very good as well. And let's see. Yeah, various asters can be good as well. I can't remember what I had in my old yard, but any variety of flowering plants that are native are usually a good thing. Lantana being number one. To the
This one in Bexar County is perceived.
yeah.
Martin Reed's agrees with me on that.
It's debatable. I think the Mexican olive is another neat plant that can bring in some pretty spectacular things as well. Yeah. Yeah, there's no wrong answer to it. And to the question about photography, so I'm a pretty novice photographer. Most of these images represent me getting lucky. I started with an iPhone camera. That's how I recorded my first 50-odd species in my yard. And then my wife bought me a DSLR camera back in 2019. And so I started with, I think, 125 millimeter lens. Then I splurged on the 400 millimeter lens so I could use it to photograph birds. And that's what I use now exclusively. So I have a Canon 7D Mark II. It's a mirrored camera with a 400 millimeter telephoto, which is not to say that's what you need to photograph butterflies. I'm lucky to have that now. But really any camera, I bought my daughter a point and shoot. I've gotten her into photographing butterflies. Anything will work, including cell phones, which is not the case for birds, but for butterflies, yes.
Awesome. Well, I think you did such a great job. Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure.